Sargon the Great, from abandoned child to world conqueror. Amid the arid deserts of Mesopotamia, where ancient rivers once nourished the flourishing Sumerian civilization, a new empire rose like a thunderclap. It did not rise by inheriting divine authority, nor by noble bloodline, but began with a child, abandoned in a basket of reeds. They called him Sargon, the rightful king, and his story is a blend of legend, blood, power, and a destiny impossible to resist. Akkad, the first empire in human history, conquered not only with sword and spear, but by establishing the first blueprint of centralized rule the world would come to replicate. But the summit of power is also where collapse begins. When a man dares to call himself a god, will the cosmos forgive? You are about to embark on a journey that spans over 4,000 years to the beginning of everything we now understand about power. Not everyone is born to be a king, but some, even as nameless children drifting in reed baskets on a river, already carry the mark of destiny. Sargon, a name that would one day evoke both terror and admiration across Mesopotamia, began his life as a nobody. No one knew his name. No one wanted to raise him. No one could have imagined that he would become the first emperor in the history of mankind. No one. The Sumerians never called him Sargon. That name was given by later generations, derived from the Akkadian Qin, meaning the legitimate king. But before he became king, he had no homeland. According to a legend inscribed on a clay tablet discovered in the ancient city of Ashur, Sargon's mother was a priestess who had to hide her child because he was forbidden to exist. She placed him in a basket and set him adrift on the river, just as Moses would be described centuries later in the Bible. The child was found and raised by a royal gardener in the Sumerian court. Growing up among trees and palaces, Sargon learned two crucial things: how to observe power from the outside and how to silently move within it. He was not noble, not royal, had no divine patron, but he had sharp intellect, boundless ambition, and a charisma that made even the most powerful city-states uneasy. As a young man, Sargon became a cupbearer, seemingly a lowly but strategically critical role, to King Ur-Zababa of Kish. There, he learned how to organize armies, collect taxes, govern administration, and more importantly, he learned the weaknesses of Sumerian rulers. In the 24th century BCE, Mesopotamia was in chaos. The Sumerian city-states, once thriving centers like Ur, Lagash, Uruk, began warring over water, farmland, and religious authority. In that disorder, Sargon saw opportunity. No one knows exactly what he did with Ur-Zababa. Some texts describe betrayal and exile. Others suggest he escaped assassination and raised his own army. Some believe he led a silent coup, earning the loyalty of soldiers disillusioned with the priestly elite. Whatever happened, when the smoke cleared, Sargon ruled Kish, and from there launched the longest military campaign Mesopotamia had ever seen. But Sargon didn't want just one city-state. He wanted everything. Within a few years, he defeated Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, and Eridu. But what was astonishing was not that he won. It was that he held the land. In the ancient world, many generals conquered territory, only to lose it soon after. But Sargon was different. He installed Akkadian governors, replaced local rulers, and enforced the use of Akkadian language, currency, and gods alongside the Sumerian pantheon. This was not just war, it was assimilation, an empire formed by intellect as much as by iron. Akkad, the capital of his empire, was built in a location so mysterious that archaeologists today still cannot pinpoint it. All we know comes from later texts describing a grand city. Temples made of stone, brick-paved roads, vast granaries, and Sargon's palace at its center, where he received emissaries from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. Trade routes reached as far as Lebanon, cedar wood, Anatolia, copper, Iran, tin, and possibly even Oman, gold, indicating Akkad's influence extended beyond the Middle East. But Sargon was more than a conqueror or trader. He was one of the first political thinkers, the man who invented the concept of empire, a centralized authority ruling over diverse peoples and cultures through a mix of force and flexibility. To manage his vast domain, he built a messenger relay system, established regional governors, and created unified taxation laws. Regardless of language, all subjects had to record transactions using cuneiform script, but now written in Akkadian instead of Sumerian. Sargon was also deeply aware of image and propaganda. He had numerous statues and reliefs carved, in bronze and diorite, showing himself with a long beard, pointed crown, holding a scepter, flanked by divine protectors. He was the first to declare himself born of the gods, a political strategy that future emperors from Egypt to China would emulate. In Akkad, the deification of power began with him. After unifying Mesopotamia, Sargon expanded northward into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and eastward into Elam, now Iran. His empire stretched thousands of kilometers, something never before seen. Ancient inscriptions said, "Under Sargon's feet, the four corners bowed, none dared oppose him." Exaggerated? Perhaps, but no one before Sargon had reached such magnitude. Yet beneath the glory, resistance simmered. The Sumerians did not forget their roots. They accepted conquest, but in their hearts, they were still the children of ancient gods. Their priests were exiled, rituals altered, and their sacred language, Sumerian, replaced by Akkadian in official records. Rebellions sparked in temples, spread to villages, and smoldered in myths and whispered curses. Even so, Sargon held the empire together for the rest of his life. According to inscriptions, he ruled for 56 years, a figure debated, but if true, a staggering achievement. Upon his death, his son Rimush succeeded him, but was immediately met with uprisings. What Sargon had built began to tremble, as happens with all empires once their founder is gone. But the more important truth was this: he had proven that total empire was possible, and after him, history would never return to the fragmented past. Sargon, once a nameless child abandoned in a basket, became the first human to conquer an entire civilization and build a model of empire that the rest of the world would one day follow. Rome, Persia, China, Byzantium, each carried echoes of him. A man once thought to have no home, no bloodline, no right, who went on to write the first chapter in the global history of power. The Great Conquest, how Sargon built and governed the first empire. After defeating the major Sumerian city-states and gaining control of Mesopotamia, Sargon didn't stop at unification. Unification was merely the beginning. The true empire began when he achieved something no one in that era believed possible, maintaining lasting control over a vast territory stretching thousands of kilometers, encompassing dozens of languages, religions, and customs. Under Sargon, Akkad was not just another kingdom like the city-states before it. It was an entirely new entity, operated on principles that had never existed before in history. First came the professional standing army. Instead of relying on seasonal militias like the Sumerians, Sargon built a full-time military with a clear hierarchy, permanent barracks, logistics support, and disciplined command structure. This became the foundation for every military campaign that followed. The Akkadian army was not only large, but also mobile, capable of moving quickly across deserts, mountains, and flooded plains thanks to tight logistical planning and the use of local knowledge from conquered regions. But Sargon did not wage war merely to expand territory. Every campaign was strategic, targeting key areas such as trade crossroads, precious metal sources, fertile plains, or routes connecting inland to the sea. In regions too weak to resist, he used political marriages and tributary alliances. For more defiant regions, he overwhelmed them with absolute force. Within a few years, he expanded the empire eastward to the Zagros Mountains, south to the Persian Gulf, and west toward the borders of modern-day Syria. However, conquest was one thing, maintaining control was another, and Sargon understood this better than anyone. To manage such a sprawling domain, he divided the empire into administrative units called provinces, or regions. Each was placed under an ensign, or provincial governor, often an Akkadian loyalist or one of his successful generals. These governors had the authority to collect taxes, command local troops, and enforce the law, but they were directly accountable to the central government, where a bureaucracy established by Sargon handled inter-regional affairs. Sargon also organized a structured road and communication network. A chain of postal stations stretched across the empire, allowing messengers to change horses, rest, receive new orders, or send reports back to the capital. This early relay system was a prototype of the Pony Express or the royal courier lines of the later Persian Empire. Through it, Sargon could monitor the state of each region, make swift decisions, and crush any sign of rebellion in its infancy. Alongside administrative control, Sargon implemented a religious integration policy. He realized that raw power could not last without psychological influence. He did not ban the Sumerians from worshipping their old gods, but gradually introduced Akkadian deities into the official pantheon, especially the goddess Ishtar, the Akkadian version of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, whom he deified as the divine mother of his royal lineage. In later texts, he claimed that Ishtar herself aided him in battle and had chosen him from the dust to rule the four corners of the world. This was a major turning point. People in the conquered territories did not feel forced to abandon their faiths, but were instead encouraged to worship Akkadian gods alongside their local ones. Over generations, beliefs blended into a new syncretic system, with Akkad at the center. The empire did not fall to religious uprising. On the contrary, it absorbed local belief systems and transformed them into its own. Another powerful tool in Sargon's hands was language. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue, was imposed as the official language of government and military affairs. Though the script remained cuneiform, inherited from the Sumerians, all content, laws, contracts, edicts, correspondence, was now composed in Akkadian. This was a deeply strategic move. It created a sense of unity and forced conquered regions to learn the central language, thus making them increasingly dependent on the imperial administration to interpret and enforce laws. However, Sargon did not abolish the Sumerian language. On the contrary, he allowed it to survive in religious and ceremonial texts, preserving it as a sacred tongue. This clever compromise allowed Sumerian to endure for centuries, much like how Latin survived in the Christian Church long after it vanished from daily use. At its height, the Akkadian Empire was not just a military machine. It was a massive political, cultural, and commercial ecosystem. Trade routes were tightly controlled. Taxes were collected consistently. Temples were erected in every province. Artisans, scholars, and priests, regardless of ethnicity, were recruited and brought to the capital to serve the state. In many ways, this was the first centralized bureaucracy in human history, a model repeated by nearly every future empire. Many believed Sargon was merely a warrior, but in truth, he was the first to understand that power didn't lie in the sword, but in the ability to make people obey without using the sword. This philosophy was passed down to his descendants. Yet, as history often reminds us, not all successors possess the strength of their founders. After Sargon's death, his son Rimush took the throne, but was assassinated within a decade. Rimush's brother Manishtushu succeeded him, and was later followed by Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, considered the most successful heir. Naram-Sin continued expanding the empire and went so far as to proclaim himself a living god, an unprecedented claim. But that very hubris would open a new chapter, the rebellion of the gods and the fall of an empire once thought invincible. That is a story for another time. But before we move on to the coming downfall, one thing must be made clear. Sargon and Akkad redefined what it meant to be an empire, not just in size or longevity, but in strategic thinking, cultural assimilation, administrative control, and the symbolic consolidation of power. Under Sargon, ancient humanity understood for the first time what it meant to live under a vast centralized order, where all life orbited a single core, one man, one capital, one belief system. Sargon did not just conquer land. He conquered the very mindset of his age, and from there he paved the road for every empire that followed, built upon the sun-baked bricks he laid in the Mesopotamian desert. The fall after Sargon, famine, rebellion, the legend of Naram-Sin, and the wrath of Enlil. No dynasty lasts forever, and no legend is immune to the very reality it creates. Sargon the Great, the founder of the first empire in human history, built a solid structure of power, a system of order, and an intricate web of political and religious links that spanned all of Mesopotamia. But like any peak, that summit laid the foundation for decline. And when he died, what remained was not a stable empire, but a bleeding question whispered through the ages. Can an empire outlive the man who built it? Sargon's immediate successor was his son, Rimush. According to inscriptions, Rimush had to face a series of revolts from Sumerian city-states, where the priestly and native noble classes had never accepted the legitimacy of Akkadian rule. He crushed the uprisings with bloodshed and reasserted control, but Sargon's shadow was too large, and Rimush lacked his father's brilliance or political finesse. He was assassinated within a decade, not because of military defeat, but due to fractures within Akkad itself. The very men who had sworn loyalty to Sargon now began to question the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. Next came Manishtushu, Rimush's brother. He ruled with an iron hand, launched military campaigns down to the Persian Gulf, and established new trade hubs. However, he met fierce resistance from the kingdoms of Elam, modern-day Iran. Despite a few battlefield successes, he too was assassinated, another sign of increasing instability within the Akkadian court. The military lost its unity. Provincial governors developed personal ambitions, and in many outer regions, the people began dreaming of autonomy once more. Then, a spark of hope appeared. Naram-Sin, son of Manishtushu and grandson of Sargon. History would remember him not only as the last great ruler of Akkad, but as a symbol of imperial tragedy, the man who reached the peak and then plunged into the abyss from a single, irreversible mistake. Naram-Sin was a brilliant and ambitious leader. He quelled rebellions, defeated enemies to the east and north, and expanded Akkadian territory as far as Syria's borderlands. Under his rule, the empire reached unprecedented heights. But what made him extraordinary and controversial was his declaration that he himself was a living god. Not just chosen by the gods, or divinely favored, but a literal deity. Ancient texts describe him as Naram-Sin, king of the four quarters, god of Akkad. A famous stele depicts him standing over his enemies' corpses, wearing a horned crown, a symbol reserved for deities, with two suns shining down upon him. Beneath him, his foes kneel in submission, offering tributes. This was not just royal propaganda, it was a bold declaration. King and god were now one, but that declaration would mark the turning point of crisis. In Sumerian Akkadian cosmology, Enlil, the god of wind and divine order, was the supreme deity who maintained balance between heaven and earth. For a mortal to proclaim divinity was an unforgivable insult. In later myths, this act of hubris is what provoked Enlil's wrath. He withdrew his protection from Akkad, unleashing famine, floods, droughts, and uprisings, all at once. Then came the nightmare from the north, the Gutians, a nomadic people from the Zagros Mountains. For centuries, they had been viewed as barbarians by Mesopotamian city-states, so insignificant they were barely recorded in official texts. But, as history often proves, those most underestimated are the ones who end it all. Exploiting Akkad's weakness, the Gutians descended like a storm, looting, killing, razing, and delivering the final blow to what was once the mightiest empire on earth. No one knows exactly how Naram-Sin died. Some legends say he was killed in a rebellion. Others claim he committed suicide, abandoned by the gods. Whatever the truth, his death ushered in a dark age that lasted for centuries, known as the Mesopotamian Dark Age. There was no central government, no empire, only scattered towns, self-governing city-states, and the Gutians roaming like ghosts in legend, sowing chaos across the land. A tablet written about 2 centuries after Akkad's fall records this chilling passage. When Naram-Sin declared himself a god, Enlil grew enraged. He shattered the irrigation canals, salted the fields, and unleashed the Gutians like a flood. The people starved. The cities fell silent. The name Akkad vanished from the lips of children. This wasn't just history. It was a cautionary tale, a haunting warning that when man's arrogance dares to breach sacred boundaries, the result is annihilation beyond reversal. Still, it's worth noting, the Gutians did not destroy everything. They occupied, coexisted, and eventually faded into obscurity themselves. But one thing was clear: the Akkadian Empire would never rise again. What remained were fragments, a few inscriptions, temple ruins, scattered names echoing through time, and hundreds of thousands of clay tablets chronicling a period both glorious and devastating. Yet collapse did not mean failure. Akkad, as a prototype, had planted the seed of empire in the human imagination. After Sargon, every major civilization, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, would emulate the model. They organized standing armies, divided territories, established bureaucracies, assimilated religions, and ruled through a common language. And each time they did, consciously or not, they walked in the footsteps of a child once cast adrift in a basket on the river. Akkad fell. But the idea of empire endured. And within that idea, Sargon, Rimush, Manishtushu, Naram-Sin, and even the wrath of Enlil still whisper through the broken bricks and crumbling tablets where once stood the center of the ancient world. The legacy of Akkad, its influence on Babylon, Assyria, and the modern concept of empire. If anything survives the fall of an empire, it is legacy, and no ancient empire cast a longer, deeper shadow than Akkad. Though its reign lasted barely 2 centuries, the form that Sargon and his descendants built became a template for all later political power structures, not just in Mesopotamia, But anywhere humanity dared to organize, dream of dominance, or believe in an overarching order, Akkad is gone, but it remains, silently and resiliently, as the invisible backbone of every civilization that rose after it. The first and foremost legacy Akkad left behind was the concept of a centralized empire, a system with a supreme ruler, a unified administration, a class of bureaucrats overseeing vast lands, and a network of communication connecting all parts. Before Akkad, the Sumerian city-states were merely independent micro-kingdoms, despite sharing language and culture. Under Sargon, for the first time, the revolutionary idea that diverse lands could coexist under a single banner became a reality. And those who followed, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, could not help but adopt the same model. After Akkad's collapse, Mesopotamia fell into chaos for nearly a century. But around 1900 BCE, a new empire rose, Babylon. Founded by the Amorites, Babylon drew heavily from Akkadian state models. The famous Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone, looked very different from earlier Sumerian laws in form, but in terms of issuance, social hierarchy, and types of punishment, it echoed Akkad. The absolute authority of the king, the professionalization of the courts, and the centrality of the capital city. Assyria, the later military superpower, was essentially an expanded replica of Akkadian design. A professional army, provincial governors appointed by the king, high-speed courier networks, and a massive archival system. All these were first tested under Sargon. Assyrian kings openly praised their Akkadian predecessors, even calling Sargon the founder of all power. In the library of Ashurbanipal, Akkadian tablets were meticulously copied, preserved as model documents of governance. Akkad's influence extended far beyond the Middle East. Empires like the Hittites in Anatolia, Elamites in Iran, Urartu in Armenia, and later the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great all implemented organizational strategies pioneered by Akkad, maintaining local structures while embedding central oversight, using religion to legitimize power, and spreading symbols of authority through art, monuments, reliefs, rituals. Akkad was also the first civilization to construct the image of a king as a supernatural political, religious, military being, a figure duplicated for millennia. From Sargon to Rameses II, from Alexander the Great to Caesar Augustus, from Qin Shi Huang to Napoleon, all carried the silhouette of one man, a king not born to rule, but one who forged his destiny into absolute power through will alone. Culturally, Akkad did not destroy Sumerian foundations, but instead blended and elevated them. In education, cuneiform schools taught both Sumerian and Akkadian, creating a rare bilingual intellectual class in prehistory. In religion, Akkadian gods did not replace Sumerian deities, they merged, creating a synthesized pantheon that became the basis for Babylonian and Assyrian religion. Even in linguistics, Akkad left a monumental legacy. Akkadian became the first diplomatic language in recorded history, used in correspondence between kings across the ancient Middle East, from Egypt to Hatti, from Mitanni to Elam. The Amarna tablets in Egypt contain hundreds of letters written in Akkadian, even though neither the sender nor the recipient were Akkadian. For the first time in history, a language transcended borders to become a regional political tool, just as Latin did during the Roman Empire or English does today. Even long after the empire's fall, later kings tried to revive the image of Akkad, as if to bind themselves to its sacred power. In Babylon, many kings named themselves after Sargon. Babylonian theologians rewrote Sargon's myths in reverent tones, deifying him as one chosen by the gods from birth. Some rulers even claimed to have dreams of Sargon, where he handed them a divine sword and a blessing, a way of declaring themselves spiritual heirs of the First Empire. As a symbol, the image of a ruler born with no status but chosen by the heavens to rule the world, Sargon's core identity, became a repeating motif in later myths. Moses, Romulus, Karna, and even gods like Krishna share similar stories: humble origins, abandonment, outsider upbringing, and a return to seize destiny. In this sense, Sargon is not just historical, he is mythical, a subconscious archetype of inverse fate, where the lowest can rise to the highest by will and divine purpose. Akkad also left its mark on administrative writing and archival practices. Akkadian archives were the first to classify documents by subject: legal, economic, military, religious, personal correspondence. This was the seed of modern archives. Additionally, Akkadian chronicles, recording dates, events, and developments in order, were the forerunners of historical writing. Thanks to this structure, we can trace the formation, fall, and echoes of Akkad across thousands of years. But more than anything, Akkad's deepest legacy was its demonstration that humanity could organize itself beyond tribal instincts. Before Sargon, power was fragmented and people were divided. No one believed in living under a larger structure. But after Akkad, humankind learned that with will, structure, and vision, we could live under a unified system, an empire, and from there steer collective destiny. Thus, Akkad is not just history. It is the blueprint for every grand political order to follow. And even if the modern world no longer speaks its name, we still live under its shadow. From world maps divided by nation-states, to the idea of supreme leadership, to government bureaucracy, communication systems, and the deification of power. All of it once began as a seed, sown in the Mesopotamian desert beneath the footsteps of a man who once had nothing but a reed basket and a fate etched in sand. Akkad, the first empire in human history, was not just a political entity. It was humanity's first declaration to the world that we could rise above tribe, language, and God, and live under a greater order. Though the empire is gone, its imprint still shapes our world. And from that basket, Sargon still whispers, "Never underestimate the one who has nothing, for he might rewrite the history of mankind."